Hello, my friends. It's Bradley J. and Bob Allison. Welcome to the Bradcast. Today we're going to talk about the Boston Massacre trials. We'll move beyond the Boston Massacre, and we have as our guest Bob Allison from Suffolk University and chair of the Rev 250, Revolution 250 group, which is a group that celebrates the events leading up to, and I suppose in some cases after the Boston Massacre. I can't be sure about that. Up to the Revolution. And of course, that would include the Boston Massacre. Welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Great to see you, Bradley.
Well, you turned me on to this documentary, Beyond the Bloody Massacre. And
Yes.
It is associated with a group called Quincy 400. Wow.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that?
So Quincy 400, it's a program in the city of Quincy, really to commemorate Quincy's history, the 400 years plus of Quincy. And for one of the central events for Quincy, of course, it's the birthplace of John Adams. It's also the birthplace of Josiah Quincy. That town's named for the Quincy family. And John Adams and Josiah Quincy were the chief counsel for the defense in the Boston Massacre trial, the trials of Captain Preston and the 8 soldiers who were accused. Actually, they did shoot into a crowd on March 5th, 1770, in what the colonists called the Bloody Massacre. And the Boston Massacre is an event that looms large in our historical consciousness and the story of the Revolution. And so these guys take the case for the accused, the soldiers and Captain Preston, probably the most hated people in Boston at the time. And you think about it, they fire into a crowd without, according to the law, provocation, and without a civil magistrate declaring this to be a riot, an unlawful assembly. And there was a sentiment in the town that these guys should just be summarily executed. And Adams and Quincy, who were among the leading patriots at the time, in fact, Josiah Quincy's nickname was the Patriot, take their case. The Patriots were the ones who wanted to get these soldiers out. The leading patriots wanted to hang them, but Adams and Quincy defend them. Not only defend them, give them such an able defense that all of the soldiers are acquitted, except for 2 who are found guilty of manslaughter and then branded on the thumb with an M, so they won't commit manslaughter again. They get benefit of clergy, a legal protection. You're branded on the thumb. And this is why, by the way, you raise your right hand in court, so they can see if you've ever had a brand indicating you've already committed. You can only get away with it once.
I love that. So your rap sheet basically was branded onto you.
Yes, it was, exactly. You're branded. And then, so yeah, it's not painless, but on the other hand, they're not being hanged. Manslaughter still would hang you in the 1700s.
Wow. All right, I have some questions now. First, this is a movie, a film.
Yes.
And it was shot in the area locally at 3 or 4.
In Quincy.
Part of it in Quincy, 3 or 4 locations.
Yes.
What were the locations? Do you know?
Yes. So the city of Quincy staged this. They found the talent, and by the talent I mean the historians, and then also the location. So in John Adams's birthplace and in John Quincy Adams's birthplace, which was John Adams's law office. So in the birthplace, I'm actually interviewed there, sitting in the fireplace, talking about John Adams's role in the massacre. And then in the next house, John Quincy Adams's birthplace, Hilaire Zobel, who wrote really the standard book on the Boston Massacre, is talking about Adams and the trial. And then in the Josiah Quincy house, actually outside the Josiah Quincy house, is Dan Coquelet, who has probably the world's leading authority on Josiah Quincy, the younger counsel, the patriot. And we can talk more about Josiah Quincy, who's a fascinating character. And then at the Thomas Crane Library, which is a wonderful building in Quincy, designed, I think, by Henry H. Richardson, a wonderful building. Karima Lewis, who is a scholar who focuses on African Americans in the 18th century, she talks about Crispus Attucks, as well as some of the African Americans who testified for the defense. A fellow named Newton Prince, who's a pastry cook, free man, and he's a witness. And Andrew, who is a slave owned by Oliver Wendell. And Oliver Wendell is a prominent member of the Boston establishment. His grandson is Oliver Wendell Holmes, the poet, and his great-grandson is Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice. But Andrew is a witness for the defense. And then one of our panelists, Serena Zabin, lives in Minnesota, couldn't come here for the filming. So what she was actually filmed in Minnesota, but her background is the council chamber of the old State House, the building that stands roughly over the site where the massacre happened.
When those two men were born, there was no Quincy, the location. I suppose Quincy, the family name. What was the event that created a Quincy? It was Braintree, and something must have happened. So they found a Quincy.
It was the northern parish of Braintree, and its population had grown. And Braintree, had its town government, and they felt underrepresented in the Braintree town government, and so they wanted to break away. And they did it in 1793. So it's shortly after the foundation, the United States Constitution, and so on. So it's the early 1790s when Quincy breaks away and becomes an independent town, later becomes a city. And the Quincy family had been here since the 1600s. And in fact, Josiah Quincy is a name that recurs. The Josiah Quincy in our story dies in 1775. He's quite young. He has tuberculosis, and he had traveled to England. And he dies actually on a ship off Nantasket. He sends a message ashore saying, "Send someone out to talk to me. I have information I can't write down." And he dies before that happens. He leaves a 3-year-old son, whose name is also Josiah Quincy. And that Josiah Quincy grows up to be a member of Congress, a lawyer, and he is the second mayor of Boston. In fact, he's still called the Great Mayor.
Wow.
And I always say that with some trepidation, worrying the current mayor will overhear this. But Quincy is certainly somewhat tenuous. Served 6 terms as mayor. Terms then were 1 year, then is voted out, and he becomes president of Harvard. And so the family typically calls him the president because he was president of Harvard. And you may say, well, why didn't they call him the mayor? I mean, his statue is in front of the old Boston City Hall. Well, because his son, whose name is also Josiah Quincy, was elected mayor in the 1850s. And then,
what a family,
and then his son, Josiah W. Quincy, was mayor in the 1890s. So 3 Josiah Quincy's mayors in the 19th century.
Okay, let's get to the events that sparked the trial and the trial itself. Give me the 60-second version of the events of March 5. But if you can set the scene, like, how did it feel weather-wise? Was it dark? Was it light? Was it cold? There was snow on the ground. Was snow falling? Any details like that you can give? Because I like details, and I know you have details.
It was a dark and clear night, and there was a crescent moon above. And on the streets, there would have been some ice, snow, the slush we know about, as well as things like horse droppings, pig dung, other things, oyster shells. The streets would have been pretty dirty. And the crowd first gathered in front of Faneuil Hall to go and attack the barracks that was in a warehouse up at Brattle Square, roughly where the government center T station is. And they get disappointed in trying to get the soldiers there to respond. So they come down an alleyway, and there they see in front of the customs house a British sentry who is pushing a group of boys, teenagers, are attacking the sentry, taunting him, calling him names. And they see the sentry push, this boy falls to the ground, and then the crowd that had just been attacking the British barracks comes to attack this sentry, Private U. White, who's a guy in his 20s, and he has been standing guard in front of the customs house. Now the crowd surrounds him, and more people come, hearing there's some kind of a commotion. And someone breaks into the first church, starts ringing the bell, which is a signal for fire. So you hear the fire bell, you come out to see where the fire is. So more people are coming out into the street. Here they see something happening. Someone goes up to the British guardhouse across from the old State House and tells the officer on duty, this guy's about to get killed here. So Captain Preston gathers 7 soldiers. They march down the street to get Private White, bring him back to the barracks, because all the British troops know we're under attack. We have to get inside. And they get to the front of the customs house through the crowd, and then they're trapped there. And now the crowd starts really pummeling them. And one of the Crispus Attucks has made his way through the crowd, tries to grab Private Montgomery's rifle, and someone hits Montgomery over the head with a brick bat, and Montgomery shoots, and he kills Attucks. Private Kilroy next to him shoots and kills John Gray, who is a rope worker. And then some of the other soldiers also fired. Captain Preston gets in front of them, says, "Why did you fire?" And then now we have 3 people lying dead. Another, Samuel Maverick, an apprentice who was shot in the back as he's trying to leave, makes his way home and he dies the next day. And Patrick Carr, who he had seen this big mob, and he had been in Ireland, and he knew that mobs and British troops and usually ended badly. He is leaving and he is hit in the back, and he makes his way home and he dies the next week. So you have 5 people dead, but when the crowd sees, they hear the gunshots, they see people dead, the crowd is stunned. And Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor, makes his way to the scene, comes and he goes up to the balcony of the old State House and says, tells everyone, "Go to your homes. The law will take its course. I will live and die by the law." He spends the rest of the night taking depositions from witnesses, and early the next morning, he has Captain Preston and the soldiers arrested for murder because they have shot at an unarmed crowd without provocation and without a magistrate saying this is a riot.
This is a real good time to talk about the play that took place that we went to. It takes place in the old State House because this is the exact time now. After they've been arrested, the next day they're trying to figure out what to do. And the play's based on what action should we take as the government. Talk about that play and where it takes place in that whole thing. Maybe that'll come back, I hope.
I hope it will. Patrick Graybar, who's a very talented playwright, did this based on the events in the council chamber where everyone wants to keep calm, keep peace.
In the old State House.
In the old State House.
Which, by the way, looks probably is only 50 paces from where the massacre took place. And the windows look right out over the events.
Right, exactly. So you're in the room where this all happened. This discussion took place. And Hutchinson and the council the council is chosen by the legislature. So they are a legislative body, but they're supposed to advise the governor. And the governor really is unsure what to do. And then he gets a delegation from the town meeting keeps coming in, led by Samuel Adams, and they want to get the soldiers out of town. And the governor doesn't think he has the authority to remove the troops. And if you don't remove the troops, is there going to be more rioting? On the other hand, if the troops are here, is that going to bring on more rioting? Benjamin Franklin had said, sending troops to keep the peace in Boston is like setting up a blacksmith's forge in a gunpowder magazine. And John Adams will say that for every riot the troops put down, they're going to create 2 more. So you have this idea, well, what do you do? And then Hutchinson says, well, I don't have the authority to move the soldiers. And it was 2 regiments in town, the 14th and the 29th. And it seemed it was soldiers from the 29th who were involved in this. And then someone suggests, actually, it is the officer in charge of the 14th says, well, how about if we just get the 29th out of town, move them to Castle William? And then Samuel Adams said, you just said you didn't have the authority to move.
Yeah. Was he passing the buck on this, Hutchinson?
He's trying. I think he's genuinely trying to find some way out of this that will not lead the town to burn and not bring on more rioting. Hutchinson's kind of a mild-mannered guy, and he becomes the central figure of hatred for the Patriots. I'm more sympathetic to Hutchinson as he was kind of a mild-mannered college professor type. And in fact, he is an historian. So he is trying to figure out a way to keep Massachusetts as part of the empire, not have the people of Boston rioting. And what's the best way to do this? So he says, General Gage in New York is the guy who commands all the British troops. I can't do anything without him. And then when Colonel Dalrymple says, well, how about if we move the 29th? Adams says, well, you just said you couldn't move either of the regiments. Now you can say you can move one. Well, if you can move one, you can move both. So that's really what's happening. And now another piece of this that Serena Zabin really brings in her book is that a lot of the soldiers who'd been in town for a couple of years had established relationships with people in town. I mean, some of them brought their families and they're renting rooms and they're staying in households. Others had married young women from Boston. And so one thing the town is trying to do is show the soldiers are complete outsiders. not say, we know most of them. In fact, one of the things that comes across in the trial testimony is these people knew each other. There's a witness who says, yeah, so-and-so came to my house and he was saying, if you ever had a chance to fire on these people, he would. Well, what's he doing in this guy's house saying this? And then the lawyer says, well, was he in liquor when he said this? No, he wasn't. And others talk about these, the Montgomerys. Private Montgomery is one of the guys branded on the thumbs. He and his wife apparently quarreled with all of their neighbors. They were, I guess, the kind of neighbors you don't want to have just because they were kind of outspoken. And so that comes across, these personal relationships that are developed between soldiers and townspeople. Remember, this is a very small town. Only about 12,000 people in the town, and it's compact. So you would have seen these people every day. And the soldiers don't have a whole lot to do. So they're trying to either fit in or, and sometimes their soldiers can be a little rough. And Samuel Adams and the Patriots have been trying to draw this line between the soldiers and the rest of us for 2 years. And Samuel Adams really sees the massacre as an event we can use to get the soldiers out of town and show we are in the right. Now, one of Samuel Adams's great quotes is, putting your enemy in the wrong and keeping him there is a good rule in war as in politics. So he wants to get the soldiers out of town and show that we don't need them. And that's, there's a lot more to be said about this story. We think happened 251 years ago. There have been a lot of great books written about it. What more is there we need to learn? You read the trial transcript, and there are a lot of stories there about these personal relationships people had with one another, with the soldiers.
So 9 months after the massacre, the trial begins. Where does it take? A bunch of questions in a row. Where does it take place? Okay. And can you talk about how Quincy and Adams got the job? Did they want the job? Did they lobby for the job? Did they try to avoid it? What did each stand to lose or gain?
Yeah, they definitely didn't lobby for the job. They were approached by friends of the defendants, by Captain Preston, knowing that these guys need really good representation. And at the time, Adams was emerging as one of the real leaders of the Boston bar. He'd only been a lawyer for about 7 or 8 years. Still, that's a long time to be a lawyer. Quincy was a bit younger, and Quincy, it seems that Quincy was approached first. And he says he'll take it if John Adams will assist him or also be counsel. Adams tells the story a little bit differently. He says it was the next day, and it says some years later, it says the next day, a friend of Captain Preston comes to see him and says, there's this man sitting in jail, doesn't have a friend in the town. He's on trial for his life and he can't find a lawyer. And Adams, according to his memoir, says, I told him that in a free country, counsel is the last thing anyone should need when he's on trial for his life. And then he said, and Adams says, I'll take the case, but you can expect no art or address, but simply the facts. And the guy says, that's all I want. And then he says to Adams, and of course, he's innocent. And Adams says, that's for the jury to decide.
So was Adams basically saying, I'm going to mail it in? I'm going to
No, he wasn't saying he's saying, I'm not going to give a flowery speech.
Right.
But he and Quincy really prepare. They interview other people. They gather evidence. And you see Adams's notes are in the Massachusetts Historical Society, and they really are meticulous in their preparation for the case. They also, by the way, select the jury very carefully. They make sure no one from Boston is on the jury. And another thing that happens in this, Quincy's father writes to him. By the way, Quincy's older brother is the prosecutor, and Samuel Quincy. But Josiah Quincy's father writes to him and says, what are you doing defending these guys? Everyone in town wants to kill them. You really are crazy. You're throwing away your career. Because think about it. They're defending the most hated people in town. And then Josiah Quincy writes back, very similar to what Adams says. And he also said, I wouldn't have taken the case had I not consulted with Samuel Adams or William Cushing. So apparently he did consult with people in the kind of patriot movement. Would it be okay if we do this? But after that, there's not this connection. And Adams and Quincy are really trying to show something more subtle. That is, the troops are here because the British ministry thinks we cannot govern ourselves. But if you can take these soldiers who killed unarmed civilians and give them a fair trial, you can show that actually we can govern ourselves. The law works here. The courts are functioning. We're not being ruled by a mob. So that's really what they are doing by taking this case. It's arguing for self-government, not because we hate these British soldiers, but because we are able to make these rational decisions and the law will have its course.
Were there consequences for the two for taking the case? Were they harangued by their neighbors?
They weren't really harangued by their neighbors. Samuel Adams is very upset with the jury after the jury returns its verdicts, and also with some of the witnesses. Samuel Adams publishes in one of the newspapers an acrostic, that is a line using Andrew. Andrew was the guy who testified about the mob, the soldiers being under attack. And that's the essential argument Adams and Quincy are making, is these guys were under attack. They were in fear for their lives, and having evidence that they were in fear for their lives. And Andrew is someone who does give this evidence. Andrew says, I was leaving the house and I heard this big crowd. And I said to someone, what is it? Is it a fire? And my friend said, no, it's something even better, a fight. Let's go. And so Andrew goes down there and he talks about the scene. And then the last question the lawyer says to him is, Andrew, did you see people picking up and throwing anything they could find in the street? He says, yes, I did. And then he says, and Andrew, did you pick up and throw anything you saw in the street? He said, yes, I did. I mean, he was part of this. But then he can testify that, yeah, the soldiers were under attack. And Samuel Adams writes this thing in the newspaper that basically says, all Negroes are liars. So how can you believe this guy's testimony? I mean, it's really the depths to which they're going to go. So you have a divide in the town, but the trial does resolve this because people do accept the verdict. There isn't rioting in the wake of the verdict. There's some anger, I suppose, but what happens is the town commemorates March 5th of 1771 as the day of the horrid massacre, and ever after commemorates March 5th until 1783, when they say, hey, let's move the day to July 4th. And in fact, they have an oration every year. 1773, they invited John Adams to give the oration on the anniversary of the massacre, and he declined because he said it would be bad form for the guy who defended the soldiers then to give an oration about the massacre. But he said, had those soldiers been hanged, it would have been as foul a blot on Massachusetts as the execution of the witches in 1691. That is, he and Quincy are both defending the rule of law here and this rational judgment, as opposed to, the mob seeking revenge. Blood must have blood.
Where can we see this documentary? Beyond the Bloody Massacre.
It's soon to be released. They had a premiere a couple of weeks ago, and the city of Quincy is trying to find a venue for it. They hoping maybe someone like WGBH will pick it up, or it's primarily going to be, we hope, used for schools and for education. But it's a very well-made film. In fact, the producer of it is a guy in public affairs in Quincy who does have long experience in filmmaking and theater. You get a group of historians together, we'll talk about history until, someone shuts down the lights, and then we'll keep going. But you really need someone with an idea for theater and what the story is to weave it together. And it's wonderful use of the images from the time and even documents. So it's a very well done piece. I know talking about it isn't the same as actually seeing it or telling this story, which is a great story. If think about how it would have ended had the soldiers been hanged. We thought, well, in the trial, they could, you have 5 people killed, you have 9 people then charged. Well, how do you know who shot at whom? How can you hang 9 people for this? And so there is that. The fact that Kilroy and Montgomery were right in front of Attucks and Gray. Okay, we can show they did shoot, but did the other soldiers even fire their guns? And were they under attack? Well, yes, they were. That's really what Adams is showing.
So they were all charged together. Either they all got off or they all didn't. Who made that decision? Because you could have charged them individually and had individual trials.
You could have, it would have been the court's decision. And in fact, initially, Captain Preston and the soldiers were all going to be tried together. At some point in the summer, they separated the two trials. But Adams and Quincy are the lawyers for both Preston and for the soldiers. Now, you can imagine the best defense for Preston is he didn't give the order to fire. And that's, in fact, what they say. He didn't give the order to fire. And then if you're defending the soldiers, you could say, well, they were under orders to fire. But if you're the counsel for both, you really can't say that. And so that's a decision that the Superior Court makes about separating them. But Adams and Quincy are the counsel for both. And it's a long, complicated legal story. If you really want to know how it all happens, you should read Hilaire Zobel's book, The Boston Massacre. Zobel is a lawyer, retired judge. Now he's a retired judge. At the time he wrote the book, he was a younger lawyer. He had edited the legal papers of John Adams, which is another terrific source to where you can get all of the trial depositions and all of the trial testimony. It's the first trial in North America that goes on for longer than a day. In fact, it goes on for a week. And it's also the first time we have the phrase beyond a reasonable doubt used. That is, you have to show beyond a reasonable doubt that these soldiers fired without provocation. And that's really, that's another landmark in legal history.
So this is touted as kind of the bedrock of the American justice system that is beloved around the world. But how much of it just is an extension of the English system, and how much of it was tweaked to be uniquely American?
Well, it does develop, of course, from the English legal system. But remember, Massachusetts had been having trials since the 1630s. And so a somewhat different formula had emerged here. In England, if you're on trial for your life, you actually can't testify. And you don't always have counsel. So that's a new thing.
How do you, that's amazing. That's a big deal. How do you not have counsel?
That is a very big deal. Well, it's actually a live issue until the 1960s here, when the I'm blanking on the name of the case in Florida. Gideon versus Wainwright establishes the right to counsel in all cases. It had been, a state by state thing. The federal constitution guarantees right to counsel, but state constitutions didn't until Gideon versus Wainwright in the 1960s. It's it's an evolution. In fact, Josiah Quincy, one of the things he was doing as a young lawyer was transcribing cases in the Superior Court, and Quincy's records are really a phenomenal record of what happens. And the court records in general are really terrific sources for all kinds of things. But it's also, by the way, it's a panel of judges. It's 5 judges who are hearing the evidence, and then a jury, 12 jurors from Suffolk County at this time included. Chester was a separate town. This is where the jurors are from. And Adams and Quincy are being very careful not to say too many bad things about Boston. By the way, one of the lawyers for the prosecution, in addition to Samuel Quincy, is Robert Treat Paine. And Paine goes on to be actually the first Attorney General of Massachusetts under the Constitution. And Paine's whole argument is that the soldiers shouldn't have been here. In fact, that's a similar argument to what Adams and Quincy are making, but it's really not their fault. These guys are under attack. And Adams also introduces this idea that if it were a press gang that came ashore and started grabbing people, we would see people had a right to defend themselves. Why do the soldiers have less rights than citizens? Soldiers don't. And Adams begins his summation to the jury by citing John Locke and Cesare Beccaria, who is an Italian writer, who said better that one guilty person should go free than that one innocent man should be hanged. But then he ends by saying, facts are stubborn things. The law is inexorable. It must be inexorable to the lamentations of the prisoners, but deaf as an adder to the cries of an outraged populace. He's really reminding the jurors of their responsibility. And it really is these 12 jurors, just ordinary citizens who have to weigh the evidence and decide the case. And they have to be, not say, boy, these poor soldiers, they really got it bad. On the other hand, you really can't say the mob outside really wants some revenge, so I better deliver it. So it's really it's what makes this story such a powerful thing.
It is compelling. Let me just address a couple of comments, a couple of the comments that have come in. This is a question, the answer to which we take for granted, but we should not. Somebody wants to know where the old State House is. Maybe out of town, out of state.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. The old State House is at the intersection of Congress Street and State Street. So, or Washington Street and State Street, depending on which direction you come.
Right, kind of the street on either side.
It was at the head of what then was King Street, is now State Street, and Washington Street, which then was Cornhill, and now, of course, is Washington Street. So it's in the center of Boston.
And it's interesting to note, as we have talked about before, that the shore line was probably no more than 7,500 yards from the building. So it was basically right on the dock.
Yeah, and it stands in the center of Paul Revere's engraving of the massacre, and which is one reason the old State House is saved, because here it is at the center of the biggest image of the revolution. And by the way, Revere's engraving comes in for attack in the trial too. One of the lawyers, and actually one of the judges, talks about these copper plate engravings which inflame the public mind and give people a wrong perception of what happened. That is, we see the image, we know what happened. And so one thing Adams and Quincy really have to do is say, that's not what happened. That is, what you see in this image isn't actually the story.
Right. For example, Crispus Attucks is portrayed as a white man.
He is. He's not really visible in the Revere engraving. In the 1850s, an abolitionist engraving has him at the center. But yeah, those engravings, by the way, they were hand colored, so they don't color him as. But think about these soldiers fire into this crowd in Boston in 1770. One of the people killed is an African-American Native American. 3 of the witnesses are people of color. That is, there was a bigger presence of people of color in Boston then, probably, than there is today. So that's something to remember. You have Andrew and Newton Prince testifying for the defense. There is another who testifies. So so Attucks is there. And Adams talks about Attucks too in his summation. He actually saying this wasn't a mob of Bostonians. He says it was an Attucks from Framingham, a car from Ireland. That is, these outsiders who are coming and giving the good people of Boston a bad name.
All right. Thank you very much, Bob. Before we go, I want you to talk about your podcast again, Revolution 250, and tell me where people can see it and maybe what's coming up on the podcast.
Well, coming up, we have every week we talk to someone who is involved in either as an historian or as an interpreter or a museum curator. We've talked to some of the leading scholars on the Revolution, as well as folks from actually the Adams House in Quincy. The Leventhal Map Center is in collaboration with Mount Vernon, is a great series on Revolutionary War maps. And you can go to the Revolution 250 website, revolution250.org, and get a link to the podcast, or do Revolution 250 podcast, and you should be able to find it. Next week, I can't remember who we have next week, but we do have actually someone talking about the Howe dynasty toward the end of the month. And just the other day, we had a guy talking about the Battle of Valcour Island. Jack Kelly, who's written a great book about the Battle of Valcour Island in 1776, and the hero of the Battle of Valcour Island, in which the Americans built a flotilla to slow down the British advance, was Benedict Arnold. Stops the British or slows them down on Lake Champlain to prevent them from taking New York. So every week it's been great stories and great things I'm learning about the Revolution.
Also, Bob, you are, if I'm not mistaken, still working on a book about the Constitution's voyage around the world.
I still am.
And you do give lectures on that, very good lectures. And folks, if you'd like to see an encapsulated version of this, kind of a tease, Bob and I did a video along with the commander, Commander John Benda of the Constitution. And that video exists on my YouTube pages. Just find Bradley J. YouTube and you can see that. I will also post the link. So if you're seeing this, you'll probably be able, you'll be able to see that link. Pretty good video. Bob and the commander do a great job.
It was great.
And so this has been fun. And
Well,
hopefully, I'm available to do stuff with you anytime, Bob.
Great. Well, it's always great to talk to you, Bradley, and always great to talk to your listeners. So great to see you.
And if you want to help us, everybody share this, rate it. All that stuff really helps. Thanks, Bob.
Take care, Bradley.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye all.